You recently got back from a month-long trip in Australia. First off, why don't you tell us where you were located?
Thanks, Sam. So I was based in Sydney during my time reporting in Australia, but I mostly reported from a small town nestled up in the Blue Mountains, which is a community about 100 kilometers west of Sydney. The town was called Katoomba, and the Blue Mountains is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a famous region for tourists and for residents of Sydney to go out to. It's accessible by train, just a couple hours out of the city. And while I was there for all of the month of December, it was completely surrounded by fire on three sides. And Katoomba was one of many towns in the Blue Mountains that was threatened by fire during the worst stretch of the bushfire season in Australia. A season that I should note, even though I'm now back in the UK, that those fires around Katoomba are still ongoing. And despite the fact that the fires have kind of disappeared from the headlines in international news, we are not through the worst of Australia's fire season yet.
And we should say, for folks who don't have a sense of Australia, it is there's a big swath of the country. I mean, I don't know exactly how to analyze, make the analogy with United States, but much of the interior of the country is more or less desert. And so we're not talking, when you talk about Katoomba, you're not talking, 10 hours away from Sydney. You're talking a couple hours away from Sydney, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is important to emphasize because it's hard to tell on a map. Australia, as you say, has what they call a big empty middle of mostly desert, but the country is enormous. It's about the size of the US if you superimposed the two together on a map. And where I was a mere hour maximum on a train outside of Sydney, half an hour in a car. And the fires were right there. So this is not a situation that was happening sort of somewhere off in a desert in the middle of nowhere. These fires were licking at the borders of some of Australia's biggest cities.
In fact, my understanding is that currently Canberra, the capital of Australia, which is probably, I don't know, about 8 hours south of Sydney, maybe a little bit less, that is the air quality there now because of fires raging around there is also pretty horrific.
Absolutely. And just last week, the head of state in Canberra, so Canberra is the capital of Australia, and the state, which is called the Australian Capital Territory, is kind of like our Washington, D.C. So effectively, the equivalent of the mayor of Washington, D.C., declared a state of emergency in Canberra last week, which is the first time that a state of emergency has been declared for bushfires since the fire in 2003 in Canberra, which swept through, killed dozens of people, and destroyed hundreds of homes. So the situation in Canberra right now is quite tense.
All right, so give us a sense, give us a sense of the size of these fires and how long they have been going on, and then let's talk about where we place these in the context of brush fires. I mean, what we're seeing now, I should say, I guess another way of phrasing it, something that's unique to that, or is this something that every 5 years it gets like this in Australia?
Yeah, this is an important question. Let's start with the size. So I think there are two sizes to talk about when we talk about the bushfires in Australia. And I heard accounts of both of these from firefighters who I spoke to on the ground while I was there. The first is, on a smaller scale, the size of each individual fire itself is, and this gets to your second point, really unprecedented. So climate scientists and bushfire scientists have a name for fires that are over 100,000 acres in size. They're called mega fires. And one of the fires around Katoomba, to give you an example, called the Gospers Mountain Fire, because that's where it was 300,000 acres when I was there. It's now up to 1 million acres. So these are fires individually on a scale that we really haven't seen before. And then collectively, if you add up all of the area that's been burned in Australia since September, which is when the fires started, I know they kind of burst onto national and international news in December, January, but they've been going on for months now. If you add up all of the land burned, you get above 30 million acres. And to give you a sense of comparison, since that's a number that's just too big for us to really keep in our heads, the worst fire season in California in recent memory in 2018 burned 1.9 million acres. So about 15 times less than the number of acres that have been burned already in Australia.
Wow. And we should make the point too that these areas that are burning, because there's such that empty middle and it's desert like, it's not happening there, right? I mean, there's just not that much fuel essentially for these fires. It's happening closer to the coast than we would imagine. Absolutely.
And so close to the coast, in fact, that on the worst days of the fires, and this is probably what listeners will have seen pictures of, in the southwest corner of Australia, so about a couple 100 miles south of Sydney, some communities on the coast were driven onto the beaches for fear of the fires that were threatening their communities and had to be evacuated by the Australian Navy and, irony of ironies, also by Esso, which is an arm of ExxonMobil, the fossil fuel company. So you had a scene where Australians were waiting on the beach to try and escape fires that were destroying their seaside towns. So you're right, not anywhere near the middle, right on the beach itself. And we're escaping on ships that are owned by the fossil fuel company, one of the fossil fuel companies that climate scientists are telling us is responsible for the forces that are supercharging these fires.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, just that notion that you could be that close to the ocean and things could be so dry and hot that you would be forced to get to the beach to avoid the fires is just sort of, I think, hard to wrap our minds around. All right, and before we go to the break, so just to put, how long have these fires been raging at this level, and is there any sense that they're winding down? Is this, how seasonal is this?
So it is seasonal, definitely. This is summer right now in Australia, and this is always their bushfire season. And Australia has had bushfires every summer. This is a regular occurrence. The country is dry. These fires do happen. What's abnormal and completely unprecedented about these fires are two things. First, the ground that they've covered, which we've already talked about, the sheer scale is a scale that we haven't seen before. And second, the fires have been going, to get to your question, since early September, which is middle of the Australian spring and well before when a normal fire season would start. And the reason that this is important, not only, of course, because if you're a community near these fires, you've been living with fires for about 5 months now, but the other reason that this is important is that it strips firefighters of the ability to do what they call preventative burns. So normally in the spring, Australia's fire services will go through and find what they call fuel bases, basically land that is susceptible to burning, and they'll do controlled burns. Anyone in California will be familiar with this because it's something that American firefighters do as well, to try and reduce the fuel load for the fires that will come inevitably in the summer. When fires start in September, those controlled burns can't be done safely in the time that they would otherwise be done. And so when you hear people talking about fuel buildup in Australia, which is something that the conservative government has talked up a lot, saying that there was just too much fuel, and that's part of the problem. It's important to understand that the reason there was too much fuel and the reason these fires have been so hard to combat is because of the conditions that climate change has imposed on Australia now.
It's closed the window in which used to be available to exert control over the amount of fuel.
That's exactly right.
You basically outlined for us the scope and the duration of these fires, the intensity of them, how close they are to, in many instances, making Australia inhabitable in some places, for extended periods of time. I mean, you have a state of emergency in Canberra, which is the capital of the country. You also made it clear that one of the problems or one of the difficulties they're having in fighting these fires, and what the conservative government there attributed to, is a buildup of fuel, and that because of climate change, sort of a second order effect, I guess. Not only are we dealing with incredibly high temperatures for extended periods of time and dryness as a function of climate change, but the duration of these periods is long enough that there is literally not enough time for firefighters to go in and do controlled burns on the off season, as it were, as a way of keeping fuel from building up. And that, of course, is also a function of climate change. It is limiting the mitigation efforts on some level, as well as causing more extreme problems. Tell us a little bit about Australia's history in fighting climate change, not just the effects of it, but it more broadly.
Yeah, so you've got it exactly right. And these effects of climate change are impacting Australia in ways more extreme, it's safe to say, than they are impacting other developed nations right now. So Australia has the strange position, and I talk about this a bit in the article, of being one of the main perpetrators of the climate crisis, one of the main polluters in the world, and also one of its first victims, if we can put it that way. And that has taken a toll on the country's climate politics. And to understand where this all started, you have to go back to 2007. So in 2007, long ago as that now was, 68% of Australians, in a poll done by one of the main Australian think tanks, considered climate change an immediate threat that was serious and that needed direct action from their government as a response, even if that action had economic consequences or costs. 68%, over 2/3. And as a result, both sides of Australian politics, the conservative side, which is represented by the Liberal Party, so it's a bit confusing in the American jargon, but Liberal in Australia means conservative, and the Labour Party on the left, both sides agreed going into the election in 2007 that they wanted to have an emissions trading scheme, which is where you basically put a price on carbon emissions to drive those emissions.
Cap and trade type of stuff or something like that.
Exactly, cap and trade type of stuff. And that's around the same time that actually we were trying to get cap and trade passed in the US too, if you remember. So these movements were happening at about the same moment. The deal fell apart in 2007 for reasons internal to Australian politics that really are not worth going too far into.
Fair enough.
But what happened was the Labour Party, as a result, became the party, and this will be familiar to American audiences, I think, that wanted to do something on climate change, but was a little scared of its shadow as far as climate politics went. They felt burned on the emissions trading scheme and didn't want to go too much further to push hard on climate change as a main party pillar. On the other side, the Liberals, funded by a very powerful coal lobby in Australia, that is kind of the equivalent to our NRA, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of the cultural and political influence that they exert in Australian politics. the Liberal Party, funded by this coal lobby, moved into the position of a party of climate denial. And to give you a sense of how deep that spiral and divide affected the public opinion in Australia about climate change, that same poll that I cited that said that 68% of Australians thought it was an urgent problem in 2007, by 2012, that number was down to 30%.
That's amazing.
It's been an amazing regression for the past decade. And unfortunately, we're seeing that regression continue today with the current government, which is under liberal, that is to say, conservative control.
Right. We should just make it clear that when we're talking about Australian politics, liberal is more libertarian than it is liberal in the sense that we understand it here. It's the Conservative Party as opposed to the Labour Party there. All right. Well, listen, we just have about a minute and a half left. How intractable is this problem, and which way is it going? And I'm talking about the political problem. I mean, we can see what the actual physical problem is, both in terms of the world and specifically what's happening in Australia. But how intractable is this problem? Like, are the politics changing because people are face to face with it, and like denialism is sort of taking more effort, or what's happening?
Yeah, I wish I could give you a happy message on this. But what I saw in Australia was a country on a tipping point as far as its climate politics goes. And the one possible tipping point is that people are going to wake up to the fact that these fires are exacerbated by climate change, that this is what Australia's future is going to look like unless immediate climate action is taken, and that includes action by its government. Or, and this is something that I heard from politicians, from firefighters, and from concerned citizens throughout my reporting, there was a fear that what instead was going to happen is these fires were going to become the new normal, that Australians, citizens and politicians alike, were going to accept that this is the reality we have to cope with right now. And we were going to start talking more about adaptation, more about how to get used to these fires, than about actually doing anything to prevent them from getting worse. And the key to figuring out where we go from here is, I think, a question that the US is going to have to answer as well. How do we stop falling into the politics of just getting used to the climate crisis?
Right. And the tough part is it's like catching a dropping knife. It's not going to get any better, and it's not just going to stop because we've gotten used to one state of affairs. Daniel, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.